There's something about an escape story that grabs hold of us and refuses to let go. Maybe it's the sheer audacity of someone staring down impossible odds and saying, "Not today." Or maybe it's the cunning, the resourcefulness, the sheer will to survive against all expectations. Think about it. How many times have you heard a tale of someone slipping through the fingers of their captors and felt your pulse quicken? These stories aren't just thrilling, they're timeless, because no matter the era, the desire for freedom is a thread that connects us all. And when we look back at antiquity, the escapes that unfolded weren't just acts of desperation, they were feats of brilliance, daring, and sometimes pure luck. Picture this: you're imprisoned in a fortress carved into a cliffside, surrounded by guards who never sleep, with chains weighing down your wrists. The world has written you off. But you haven't written off yourself. That's the moment when history's greatest escape artists shine. From the shadowy dungeons of Rome to the remote islands where exiles were left to rot, people found ways to vanish, to outwit, to reclaim their lives against all odds. Some used tunnels dug in secret, others disguised themselves, slipping past their captors in plain sight. And then there are those who simply walked away, leaving behind mysteries that still baffle us centuries later. These stories aren't just about physical freedom, they're about the unyielding human spirit that refuses to accept defeat. Today, we're stepping into the footsteps of those who refused to be confined. This is 25 Great Escapes in Antiquity, Prison Breaks, Exiles, and Disappearances, a journey through the most astonishing jailbreaks, vanishings, and narrow getaways from the ancient world. Some of these escapes changed the course of history, others became legends whispered across generations, but all of them share one thing in common. They remind us that even in the darkest corners, hope finds a way. So settle in, because what you're about to discover isn't just a list of daring feats. It's a testament to the ingenuity, courage, and sometimes sheer stubbornness of those who dared to break free. And who knows, by the end, you might just find yourself asking, what would I have done in their place? The art of escape in antiquity wasn't just about slipping past guards or picking locks. It was a high-stakes game of wits played on an uneven field. Imagine the odds: no blueprints, no modern tools, just raw ingenuity against stone walls and iron bars. Ancient prisons weren't the sterile, regulated facilities we think of today. They were often repurposed basements, caves, or even wells, places designed not just to hold, but to break spirits. The Greeks had their notorious oubliettes, pits so deep and forgotten that prisoners were left to rot without a trial. The Romans built the carcer, a damp, windowless nightmare beneath the Capitoline Hill where enemies of the state vanished into darkness. Yet even in these grim conditions, the human spirit found cracks in the system. What's fascinating is how escape methods mirrored the cultures that created these prisons. In Greece, where philosophy prized cunning, we hear of prisoners convincing guards with clever arguments or forging alliances with sympathetic jailers. Rome, with its military precision, saw escapes that resembled tactical operations: tunnels dug over months, disguises tailored to mimic officials, even bribes slipped to the right hands at the right time. And then there were the audacious solo acts, like the Spartan general who simply walked out of his chains during an earthquake, turning nature's chaos into his salvation. These weren't just random acts of desperation. They were calculated rebellions against systems that claimed to be unbreakable. But here's the twist: many of these escapes weren't just personal victories, they reshaped history. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal escaped a Roman assassination plot by swapping clothes with a servant, he lived to fight another day, prolonging a war that would define an era. When the philosopher Apollonius of Tyana vanished from his cell before execution, his followers called it divine intervention, fueling a legend that outlasted empires. Even failures became warnings. The Persian king Cambyses Roman II executed an entire garrison after a single prisoner slipped away, proving how much these breaches terrified those in power. Because every escape, successful or not, was a crack in the illusion of control, a reminder that no cage is truly absolute. So as we journey through these stories, remember, you're not just hearing about prison breaks. You're uncovering a hidden language of resistance, written in tunneled dirt, forged keys, and whispered alliances. These escapees didn't just want freedom, they reclaimed their humanity from systems designed to erase it. And that's why their legacies endure, not because they escaped, but because they dared to try. Athens in the year 404 BC was a city holding its breath. The Peloponnesian War had ended in crushing defeat, the proud democracy now under the thumb of Sparta's puppet rulers. In this climate of fear, the prison walls weren't just holding bodies, they were testing ideals. Among the imprisoned were men closely tied to Socrates, the philosopher whose questions had already made him dangerous to those in power. Their crime: allegiance to the old order, their sentence likely death. But what happened next wasn't just a jailbreak, it was a quiet rebellion etched into history. The plan unfolded with the precision of a philosophical argument. Tools slipped past guards, perhaps hidden in food, perhaps palmed by bribed hands, became instruments of liberation. Bars were sawed under cover of night, the metallic whispers muffled by the groans of the prison itself. Ancient accounts hint at guards who looked the other way, their loyalties divided between duty and the whispered conscience of a city in turmoil. When the escapees vanished into the Athenian darkness, they left behind more than an empty cell. They left a question hanging in the air: what does justice look like when the law itself is unjust? This wasn't merely a physical escape, it was a moral provocation. Socrates himself, though offered the chance to flee, chose to stay, a decision that would immortalize him. But those who left sparked debates that echoed through the streets. Some called them traitors, cowards fleeing punishment. Others saw them as symbols of resistance, men refusing to kneel to tyranny. The historian Xenophon recounts how their disappearance became a rallying cry, proof that even under the boot of Sparta, Athenian spirit couldn't be extinguished. What makes this escape extraordinary isn't just the mechanics, it's the legacy. These men didn't just cross from captivity to freedom, they crossed into myth. Their story became a parable about the limits of power, a reminder that prisons can hold bodies but not always ideas, and perhaps that's why it still resonates today. Because every time someone chooses freedom over submission, the ghost of Athens whispers, "This has happened before, and it will happen again." Themistocles should have been untouchable. After all, this was the man who saved Athens at Salamis, the mastermind who outmaneuvered the Persian fleet and secured Greece's freedom. But in the fickle world of Athenian politics, yesterday's hero could become tomorrow's exile. Accused of conspiring with Sparta, the very enemy he'd once helped defeat, Themistocles found himself ostracized, banished from the city he'd fought to protect. The official records say he lived out his days in obscurity, a broken man. But whispers from Antiquity tell a far more intriguing tale. Because if you piece together the fragments left by historians like Thucydides and Plutarch, a different story emerges. One of disguise, deception, and a disappearance so flawless it still baffles scholars today. Picture the scene: a middle-aged statesman, once revered, now a fugitive with a price on his head. Athens had sentenced him in absentia, his properties confiscated, his name cursed in the agora. Yet instead of fading away, Themistocles seems to have staged one last masterstroke. Ancient sources describe him traveling undercover, slipping past patrols, even according to one account hidden in a merchant's cart like common cargo. His destination, Persia of all places, the empire he'd humiliated at Salamis, now became his unlikely refuge. If true, the irony is staggering. The architect of Persia's naval defeat welcomed at the court of King Artaxerxes, granted lands and titles, even advising his former enemies. Was this betrayal, survival, or something more calculated? The gaps in the historical record only deepen the mystery. Some texts claim Themistocles adopted a Persian name, living out his years as a respected advisor. Others suggest he never truly switched allegiances, that his defection was an elaborate ruse, a final service to Greece from the shadows. Then there's the curious detail from Plutarch, a funeral monument in Asia Minor, far from Athens, bearing markings that hint at the exile's true identity. No body was ever recovered, no definitive account of his death exists. Just like that, history's great naval strategist vanishes into the fog of time, leaving behind only questions. What makes this disappearance so compelling isn't just the spy thriller intrigue, it's what it reveals about power and perception in the ancient world. For Athenians, branding Themistocles a traitor cleansed their conscience. They could forget the man who saved them once his ambition became inconvenient. Yet in Persia, his legend took on new life, reframed not as an enemy but as a sage. Two cultures, two narratives, one man caught between them. Whether he died a broken exile or lived on as a Persian noble, Themistocles' escape, real or imagined, became the ultimate rebuttal to those who thought they could erase him. Because in the end, even exile couldn't contain a mind that had outwitted empires. His greatest victory may have been ensuring that, like the tides at Salamis, his story could never be pinned down. Anaxagoras wasn't just running for his life, he was running to save an idea. In 5th century Athens, where the gods shaped every aspect of public life, his radical claim that the sun was a burning rock, not a deity, landed him in chains. Charged with impiety, the philosopher stood accused of corrupting the youth, including his most famous student, Pericles himself. The sentence was death. But what unfolded next wasn't just an escape, it was a masterclass in turning intellect into action. The plan relied on the very thing Athens feared most, the power of questioning. While guards expected a broken old man, Anaxagoras' students saw opportunity. They knew Athenian prisons were porous, their security often outsourced to disinterested citizens. So under the guise of delivering a final meal, they slipped in with more than food. They brought a disguise. Robes were swapped, identities blurred. By dawn, the philosopher was gone, his cell empty save for the echoes of his teachings. Some say he hid in a merchant's wagon, buried beneath olives and wine. Others whisper he walked straight past the city gates, his new identity so convincing even neighbors didn't recognize him. The details are hazy, but the outcome is clear. Athens lost its prisoner, but history kept its thinker. Exile didn't silence Anaxagoras, it amplified him. Far from Athens, in the quiet of Lampsacus, he continued teaching, his ideas spreading like underground roots. Followers transcribed his works in secret, hiding manuscripts in pottery or beneath floorboards. These weren't just scrolls, they were time capsules, preserving his vision of a world governed by natural laws, not capricious gods. Within decades, his concepts resurfaced in the works of Socrates and Plato, proof that no decree could erase a thought once set loose. What makes this escape extraordinary isn't the theatrics, it's the legacy. Anaxagoras didn't just evade execution, he exposed the fragility of systems built on fear. Athens could banish the man, but it couldn't contain the idea that the universe operated on principles anyone could study. His flight became a metaphor. Sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't confrontation, but simply refusing to disappear. And in the end, the city that condemned him would unknowingly build its golden age on the very ideas it tried to bury. The Spartan warrior crouched in the dim prison cell, his body coiled like a spring beneath the facade of weakness. For weeks, he had played the part of the broken captive, limping, wincing at imagined pains, even leaving portions of his meager meals uneaten to sell the illusion of fading strength. His Athenian jailers scoffed, their vigilance slackening with each passing day. What threat could this battered soldier pose? But they'd forgotten the first rule of Sparta: a wolf in chains is still a wolf. Timing was everything. He waited for the storm, the kind that rattled shutters and masked sound, then struck. A sudden twist of his injured leg became a crippling kick to the nearest guard's knee. The man's scream drowned in thunder as the Spartan pivoted, using his chains not as restraints but as weapons, swinging the heavy links into a second captor's temple. Ancient accounts differ on what happened next. Some say he slithered through a gap in the prison's drainage channel. Others claim he scaled the wall using strips of torn bedding. But the outcome was the same. By dawn, the cell held only unconscious guards and a lesson in underestimation. What makes this escape legendary isn't just the audacity, it's the layered deception. The warrior didn't just overpower his captors, he rewrote their perception of him, weaponizing their arrogance. In Sparta, where physical strength was revered, his true brilliance lay in restraint. He understood that survival sometimes meant hiding one's power until the moment demanded it. The tale spread through the Peloponnese like wildfire, told not just as a jailbreak but as a parable of Spartan ethos. Even today, historians debate whether this was a lone soldier's act or part of a broader Spartan tactic, prisoners feigning weakness to exploit gaps in Athenian security. Yet the story's deepest lesson transcends antiquity. In any confrontation, the opponent's greatest weakness isn't their defenses, it's their assumptions. The Spartan didn't just escape, he exposed how easily confidence becomes blindness, and perhaps that's why his legend endured. Because whether in ancient battles or modern struggles, the quiet truth remains. Sometimes the most powerful move is letting them believe they've already won. One moment, Romulus stood before the people of Rome, the city he had built from nothing. The next, he was gone, swallowed by a sudden storm so violent, witnesses claimed the sun itself vanished. Ancient texts describe senators shielding their eyes as wind whipped through the crowd, and when the air cleared, their king was nowhere to be found. Some swore they saw him lifted into the heavens, transformed into the god Quirinus. Others whispered darker theories that the senators, tired of his rule, had torn him apart and hidden the evidence in the chaos. But what if the truth was neither divine nor violent? What if Rome's founder had simply walked away? The historian Livy captures the unease that followed. Without a body, without witnesses, the disappearance became a riddle wrapped in legend. The official story that Romulus ascended to join the gods smoothed over the instability, giving Rome a celestial patron rather than a power vacuum. Yet Plutarch hints at rumors that never quite faded, that Romulus, weary of governing a fractious nobility, staged his exit with theatrical precision. Imagine the calculation required, the storm's timing, the loyalists' position to spread the right stories, even the choice to vanish publicly, ensuring no single faction could claim responsibility. If true, it wouldn't be an escape from chains, but from something just as confining, the weight of legacy. What makes this disappearance so compelling is how it mirrors Rome's own identity. A city built on myth couldn't admit its founder might abandon it, so the narrative split: divine destiny for the masses, quiet skepticism for the elite. Even the location of his ascension, the Palatine Hill, became a stage for political theater. Generations later, emperors would reenact the scene, using Romulus' story to legitimize their own power. The irony, a tale meant to cement unity, may have sprung from division. Perhaps the real mystery isn't whether Romulus fled or was murdered, but why we need legends to explain absence. In a world without forensic science, vanishing required either a miracle or a crime, no room for mundane middle ground. Yet the lingering doubt in ancient sources suggests another possibility, that Romulus' greatest feat wasn't founding Rome, but leaving it on his own terms. After all, what's more powerful than a king who controls not just his reign, but his exit? The truth may be lost to time, but the question endures: when a leader disappears, who's really escaping the vanished or those left behind? Jugurtha's chains should have been the final word. After years of war against Rome, the Numidian king was dragged through the streets in triumph, paraded as proof of the Republic's invincibility. The Romans threw him into the Tullianum, the same dungeon where enemies of the state were left to starve in darkness. But Jugurtha wasn't just any prisoner. He was a man who'd spent his life outmaneuvering rivals, turning defeats into opportunities, and bending even his captors to his will. And so, as the story goes, when his jailers came to gloat, they found not a broken king, but a man smiling up from the shadows with a promise: "You've only caught me once." The escape itself reads like a scene from a play. Ancient sources like Sallust describe how Jugurtha's loyalists, perhaps bribed guards, perhaps disguised allies, slipped into the prison under the guise of delivering supplies. Some accounts suggest they smuggled in ropes hidden inside baskets of bread. Others claim they exploited a shift change, timing their move when vigilance was weakest. However it happened, one morning Rome woke to find the Tullianum's most infamous occupant gone, his cell empty save for a single mocking message scratched into the wall: "A king's place is among his people." The audacity was staggering. This wasn't just evasion, it was performance art, a deliberate humiliation of the system that thought it had broken him. What makes Jugurtha's flight so compelling isn't just the mechanics, but the psychology. Here was a ruler who'd spent his entire life gaming the system, playing Roman factions against each other, buying off senators, even turning his own surrender into a strategic retreat. His prison break wasn't desperation, it was chess. By escaping, he didn't just reclaim freedom, he reignited his legend. Back in Numidia, his return rallied tribes who'd begun to doubt his power, proving that even Rome's grip could be pried open. For years, he waged a guerrilla war from the hills, a phantom king who'd already slipped their grasp once. Yet the true brilliance of Jugurtha's defiance lies in its imperfection. He was eventually recaptured, yes, betrayed by his own allies, dragged back to Rome in chains a second time. But that almost makes the story richer, because even in failure, he'd exposed the fragility of imperial power. Rome could parade him through the streets again, could execute him in the Mamertine prison, but they couldn't erase the fact that he'd laughed in the face of their justice. His escape became a whisper in the Senate's halls, a reminder that no victory is permanent, and no cage is truly escape-proof. Centuries later, we're still dissecting his motives. Was it pride, revenge, or simply the refusal of a king to die on his knees? Maybe it doesn't matter. The lesson endures, not in his recapture, but in the moment he chose to reach for the lock. The siege of Veii wasn't just a battle, it was a test of patience. For 10 long years, Roman forces encircled the Etruscan city, their blockade tightening like a noose. Inside the walls, supplies dwindled and hope grew thin. But the people of Veii had one advantage Rome never anticipated: the ground beneath their feet. While their enemies camped above, Veii's defenders were digging, carving a hidden path to freedom through solid rock. This wasn't just a tunnel, it was a masterpiece of desperation and precision, proof that even in the darkest hours, human creativity could outmaneuver brute force. Ancient historians like Livy describe the operation with awe. Teams of workers toiled in shifts, their progress muffled by layers of cloth and earth to deaden sound. The tunnel's entrance, concealed beneath a temple where Roman spies would least suspect activity. Its exit, a grove of trees beyond the siege lines, far enough from patrols to allow silent escapes under cover of night. But the true brilliance lay in the misdirection. While Rome watched the gates, expecting a desperate charge, Veii leaders staged theatrical displays on the walls, shouting matches, mock drills, even fake negotiations, all to distract from the real work happening underground. The discipline was staggering. For months, not a single word of the plan leaked, a testament to a city united in secrecy. What makes this escape extraordinary isn't just the engineering, it's the psychology. The tunnel wasn't merely a physical lifeline, it became a psychological weapon. As Veii's population quietly slipped away, Roman sentries began noticing strange absences. Fewer guards on the walls, quieter streets, the eerie sense that the city was hollowing out. By the time Rome realized what was happening, the tunnel had already saved hundreds, maybe thousands. And though Veii eventually fell, its legacy endured. Future generals from Carthage to Byzantium would study this gambit, learning that the surest way to breach a siege isn't always over the walls, sometimes it's beneath them. Yet the story's deepest lesson isn't about tactics, it's about the power of collective will. Every shovel of dirt, every whispered order, every night spent guiding children and elders through darkness, all of it relied on a shared resolve to survive. No single hero emerges from Livy's account. Instead, it's a chorus of unnamed citizens who refuse to accept their fate. That's why this tunnel resonates across millennia. Because when faced with impossible odds, the people of Veii didn't just dig through earth. They carved a new path into history, proving that even the mightiest empire can't trap those who refuse to stop moving. Ovid's banishment to the Black Sea wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a cosmic joke played by fate. One moment, Rome's most celebrated poet was at the height of his fame, crafting verses that thrilled the empire. The next, he was packing for Tomis, a windswept outpost where Latin was as foreign as the howling wolves beyond its walls. The official charge, a poem and a mistake, as Ovid cryptically put it. But what could have been so damning that Augustus, the emperor who prized art as propaganda, exiled his own bard? The answer might lie not in politics, but in the dangerous power of words themselves. Picture Tomis through Ovid's eyes, no marble theaters, no salons buzzing with intellectual debate, just a frozen harbor where locals eyed him with suspicion. Yet in this cultural wasteland, something extraordinary happened. The man who once wrote playful guides to seduction began pouring his grief into letters that burned with raw honesty. His Tristia and Epistulae ex Ponto weren't just pleas for mercy, they were masterclasses in turning pain into art. With no audience but the distant emperor, Ovid did the unthinkable. He weaponized his loneliness, crafting verses so haunting they made Rome's elite uncomfortable. Imagine the irony. The poet they tried to silence became louder in exile, his voice echoing across the empire from its very edges. The mystery of Ovid's crime only deepens the intrigue. Some scholars point to his risque, Ars Amatoria, published years earlier as the offending work, a cheeky seduction manual that may have clashed with Augustus's moral reforms. Others whisper of a scandal involving the imperial family, perhaps Ovid witnessing something no poet should have seen. But the most compelling theory isn't about a single misstep, it's about the inherent threat of creativity. Ovid didn't just write, he reframed reality, turning gods into flawed lovers and emperors into characters. In a regime built on controlled narratives, that kind of imagination was inherently subversive. What makes Ovid's Exile timeless isn't the injustice, it's the transformation. Stripped of everything, he reinvented what poetry could be. His letters from Tomes mixed desperation with dark humor, comparing his barbarian neighbors to critics and his hut to a library. Even his descriptions of the frozen Danube became metaphors for a heart in exile. This wasn't just survival, it was alchemy, turning bitterness into beauty. And though Augustus never relented, history delivered the final twist. The emperor's name is etched in stone, but Ovid's words outlasted an empire, proving that banishment can't cage a mind that refuses to stop creating. 2,000 years later, his story resonates with anyone who's ever felt silenced. Because Ovid's real crime wasn't writing the wrong poem, it was reminding us that art, once unleashed, can't be recalled. Like a message in a bottle tossed into the Black Sea, his verses eventually washed up on shores he'd never see, carrying a truth that still stings. Sometimes the most dangerous place for a poet isn't the frontier, but the center of power they're forced to leave behind. The Ninth Legion's disappearance reads like a historical thriller where the last page has been torn out. One moment, there roams Iron Fist in Britain, 5,000 professional soldiers, the cream of the empire's military machine. The next, poof, gone, no battlefield strewn with their distinctive armor, no triumphant Caledonian tribes displaying captured eagles, just silence. Ancient sources mention their presence in York around the year 117 AD, then nothing. It's as if the earth opened up and swallowed them whole, and that absence, it's louder than any battle cry. What makes this vanishing so haunting is the sheer implausibility. Legions didn't just dissolve, they were bureaucratic entities, payrolls, supply chains, paperwork trailing every movement. Yet here, the trail ends abruptly. Some historians point to a cryptic line in Roman records about heavy losses in Britain around that time, but even that's frustratingly vague. No mass grave has ever been found matching their numbers. No local legends describe such a decisive victory, just a gap in the record where 5,000 lives should be. Then there's the conspiracy angle. Could they have deserted? It's almost unthinkable for a Roman legion desertion meant crucifixion, and these were men who'd sworn oaths to the death. But consider this, the Ninth had been stationed in Britain for decades, far from Rome's oversight. Some scholars speculate they might have gone native, blending into the local population. There are whispers of Latin-sounding place names in remote Scottish glens, even rumors of a hidden fortress where the legion standards were buried to protect them from dishonor. Or perhaps they were reassigned, shipped off to some eastern frontier and lost to bureaucratic error. But the most chilling theory, that Rome itself orchestrated their disappearance. The Ninth had suffered brutal losses years earlier during Boudicca's rebellion. What if they'd become unreliable, even mutinous? The empire wasn't above quietly dissolving troublesome units and scattering their survivors across other legions. It wouldn't be the first time history was rewritten to hide an embarrassment, yet the lack of closure is what keeps this mystery alive. Most military losses leave forensic traces, weapons, bones, the scars of battle on the land. The Ninth left only questions. Their story taps into something primal, the fear of being erased, of marching into the mist and never returning. Maybe that's why we keep searching for answers. Because if 5,000 armed men can vanish without a trace, what does that say about the fragility of our own footprints on history? The Ninth's greatest legacy might not be how they lived, but how completely they disappeared, and how fiercely we keep trying to pull them back into the light. The pirate stood on the execution dock with the noose around his neck, the salty wind whipping his hair like a final taunt from the sea he'd once ruled. The crowd jeered, the magistrate smirked, but the man known as Diomes of the Cyclades didn't look like a condemned criminal. He looked like a performer about to deliver his greatest act. And what happened next wasn't just an escape. It was a masterclass in turning desperation into theater. Ancient court records from Rhodes tell the bones of the story. A pirate captain, captured after years of plundering Aegean trade routes, sentenced to hang as an example to all who'd challenge maritime law. But the dry official language hides the drama that unfolded. According to sailors' tales passed down for generations, Diomes didn't plead for mercy, he entertained. He spun jokes so sharp they made the executioner pause. He recited poetry so unexpectedly beautiful that women in the crowd began tossing flowers instead of curses. And then, as the magistrate leaned forward, intrigued despite himself, the pirate made his move. Some say he offered a treasure map hidden in his boot. Others claim he revealed secrets about rival pirate fleets, information worth more than his death. Whatever the currency, by sunset, the noose hung empty. What makes this escape fascinating isn't just the audacity, it's what it exposes about justice in the ancient Mediterranean. Pirates were the ultimate outlaws, their crimes punishable by crucifixion in some ports. Yet Diomes' reprieve hints at a system more flexible than we imagine. Magistrates could be swayed by charm, bribes, or even the unspoken understanding that today's criminal might be tomorrow's useful ally. The historian Polybius wrote of similar cases where pirates bought their necks with gold or wit, suggesting these last-minute reversals weren't anomalies, they were an open secret. But the real brilliance of Diomes' story lies in its ambiguity. Unlike clean-cut tales of tunnel digs or disguise swaps, his survival rests in the gray areas of human nature. Did he truly win over the crowd, or was the whole spectacle an elaborate ruse to let officials save face while pocketing his bribe? The pirate himself never clarified. He simply vanished back into the waves, leaving behind a legend that grew with each retelling. By the time Roman admirals wrote their memoirs decades later, Diomes had become a folk hero. The rogue who proved that even the tightest noose could slip if you knew how to twist the ropes of power. Perhaps that's why his story endures, because in the end, Diomes didn't just escape death, he exposed the thin line between law and theater. His greatest theft wasn't gold or ships, but the realization that justice, like the sea, was never as fixed as it seemed. And for every ruler who thought a hangman's knot could end piracy, there would always be those who knew sometimes the right words could untie anything. Diogenes of Sinope never did anything the expected way, so why should his death be any different? The philosopher who lived in a barrel, mocked kings, and carried a lamp in broad daylight searching for an honest man, left the world with one last riddle. Ancient sources can't even agree on how he died. Some say he succumbed peacefully after eating raw octopus. Others insist he held his breath until his heart stopped. A final act of willpower from the man who believed desire was the root of suffering. But the most intriguing accounts suggest there was no death at all, just a carefully staged disappearance, leaving his students bewildered and his enemies scratching their heads. Picture the scene, an aging Diogenes, still sharp-tongued but now a target for rulers tired of his critiques. According to fragments from lost texts, he gathered his followers for a final lesson, then vanished mid-sentence. One moment he was lecturing on the futility of worldly possessions, the next, his cloak lay empty on the ground like a discarded snakeskin. Was it sleight of hand? A prearranged escape through hidden tunnels, or simply the perfect metaphor from a man who'd spent his life proving reality was more malleable than people assumed? The ambiguity feels deliberate. After all, this was the philosopher who once told Alexander the Great to step aside because he was blocking the sun. If anyone would turn mortality into performance art, it was Diogenes. The brilliance of this possible fake death lies in its layers. For his students, it became the ultimate teaching tool, a demonstration that even something as final as death could be questioned. For authorities, it was a nightmare. How do you punish a man who refuses to confirm he's alive? Rumors swirled for decades. Some claimed he resurfaced in distant lands, still mocking pretentious scholars. Others swore they saw his ghost haunting Athenian bathhouses, chuckling at the hypocrisy of the elite. The historian Diogenes Laertius, writing centuries later, collected these contradictory tales with obvious delight, preserving not a biography but a hall of mirrors. What makes this disappearance timeless isn't the mystery, it's what it says about power and truth. Diogenes spent his life exposing how fragile societal rules really are. By refusing to give the world a verifiable death, he pulled off one last subversion, proving that even the most basic facts could be destabilized with enough audacity. In an age where philosophers were being imprisoned for challenging the status quo, his vanishing act, real or imagined, became the perfect exit. No tomb to desecrate, no legacy to control. Just a lingering question that still resonates. When a man spends his entire life pretending not to care what others think, why would he start caring at the end? Perhaps that's why historians still debate his fate, because accepting a mundane death for Diogenes feels like missing the point. The man who urinated on guests who insulted him, who ate in the marketplace to scandalize those who believed eating should be private, wouldn't just fade away. He'd leave behind a puzzle wrapped in a provocation, and in doing so, he ensured something remarkable. That centuries later, we're still not sure whether to mourn him or keep looking over our shoulders, half expecting a ragged figure to emerge from the shadows with a laugh and a lamp, ready to expose our hypocrisies one last time. The crack of whips still hung in the air when the Romans arrived at the rebel camp, empty except for smoldering fires and broken chains. Their prize, the leader who'd united hundreds of enslaved people in open defiance, was gone. No trail led into the forest, no informants could name his whereabouts. Just like that, the man who'd shaken southern Italy's plantations vanished as if he'd never existed. But in the slave quarters and olive groves, whispers carried his name like a password. Salvius, the gladiator who'd traded his sword for rebellion, then slipped through Rome's grasp when the revolt crumbled. Ancient historians like Diodorus Siculus tell us Salvius wasn't just a fighter, he was a strategist. When his forces were overrun near Mount Etna, he didn't charge into a glorious last stand. He dissolved. Some accounts claim he disguised himself as a shepherd, blending into the rural poor who moved freely between estates. Others insist he retreated into Sicily's labyrinthine cave systems, places where Roman patrols feared to tread. But the most compelling theory comes from fragmentary court records, that he simply walked out of history, adopting the identity of a freedman in some distant province. Imagine the audacity, living openly under Rome's nose, his past hidden behind a new name, and the sheer arrogance of their assumption that no slave could outthink them. What makes this disappearance extraordinary isn't just the evasion, it's the ripple effect. For decades after, whenever a new slave uprising flared in Sicily or Campania, officials wondered, was Salvius behind it? Even if he'd died in hiding, the mere possibility of his survival became a weapon. His legend fed the nightmares of plantation owners who'd lie awake, listening for footsteps in the night. And for the enslaved, his escape was proof that the system wasn't invincible. Chains could break, identities could be shed. The poet Horace, writing years later, captured the elite's unease. The runaway is more dangerous than the rebel, for he teaches others how to vanish. Yet the real mystery isn't where Salvius went, it's how many followed his example. Rome's archives hint at thousands of unaccounted-for fugitives during this era, their fates lumped together as lost. But how many of those were deliberate disappearances? How many carved new lives in frontier towns or aboard merchant ships, their freedom bought not with coins but with silence? Salvia's story forces us to confront a haunting truth. For every Spartacus whose end is recorded, there were countless others who escaped the historical record itself. Their victories weren't etched in stone, but in the quiet moments when someone dared to look at the horizon and walk toward it. The cell door creaked open, but the Athenian prisoner didn't look up. Condemned to die at dawn for crimes lost to history, he'd spent his last night tracing the cracks in the stone floor, as if they might reveal a path the gods had overlooked. Then came the oracle's message, a thunderbolt wrapped in riddles. The man who flees will bring the storm, the priestess had proclaimed, her words rippling through the city like a shudder. The magistrates paled. Was this a divine warning, a prophecy that his escape would unleash catastrophe, or something far more clever, a desperate man's final gambit disguised as fate? What happened next reads like a script from the gods themselves. The jailers, terrified of invoking Apollo's wrath, did the unthinkable. They unchained the prisoner and stepped aside. Some accounts claim he walked out with his head high, as if he'd expected this all along. Others whisper of a bribe slipped to the oracle, a carefully planted rumor to exploit Athenian superstition. But the most tantalizing detail, he never reappeared. No storm came, no disaster struck, just silence where a life should have been. The brilliance of this escape lies in its ambiguity. Was it divine intervention or human cunning? The oracle's warning could have been a genuine vision after all. Ancient Greece brimmed with tales of mortals who defied prophecies at their peril. But consider the prisoner's perspective. In a society where oracles held unparalleled sway, what better weapon than to turn their power against the system? If even a sliver of doubt took root in his jailer's minds, that was all he needed. Fear of the gods became his lockpick. What makes this story endure isn't just the mystery, it's what it reveals about power and perception. The Athenians, for all their philosophy, still trembled at omens. The prisoner, whether blessed or brilliantly deceptive, understood that sometimes the strongest chains aren't iron, but the stories people believe. And in Vanishing without a trace, he left behind a question that still echoes. When the line between destiny and deception blurs, who's really pulling the strings? The gods, or those bold enough to speak in their voice? Perhaps the real prophecy was the lesson hidden in his escape. Because in the end, the storm wasn't a cataclysm. It was the unsettling realization that even the most rigid systems could be unraveled by a well-placed whisper. And that's a truth no prison could ever hold. The sand of the arena was slick with blood when the gladiator made his move. Condemned to die as entertainment for a roaring crowd, he had one advantage his captors never anticipated. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a trained fighter. The moment his shackles snapped open for the performance, he lunged, not at the beasts they'd loosed on him, but at the guards lining the perimeter. A sword ripped from a startled hand became his key to freedom. What followed wasn't just an escape, it was a spectacle so audacious, even the jeering crowd fell silent. Ancient accounts differ on the details, but the core of the story remains intact. Some historians claim he fought his way through a dozen armed men, his movements honed by years of forced combat. Others whisper that the crowd, moved by his defiance, began pelting the guards with stones, turning the arena's cruelty back on itself. What's undeniable is the aftermath. A city in uproar, soldiers scouring back alleys, and a legend taking root. Because this wasn't just a man fleeing death, it was a slave weaponizing the very violence they'd forced him to master. the deeper brilliance of his escape lies in its symbolism. Gladiators were supposed to die on command, their lives a display of imperial power. By refusing the script, this fighter exposed the fragility of the spectacle. His dash for the gates wasn't just physical, it was a rejection of the entire system that turned suffering into sport. Roman poets later spun the tale as a cautionary fable. Beware the man with nothing left to lose. But in the underground networks of enslaved people, his story became a rallying cry. If one could break the arena's grip, why not others? Yet the most haunting question isn't how he escaped, but why we'll never know his name. History records his deed, but not his identity, a reminder that Rome preferred its rebels faceless. Maybe that's the final twist, because in vanishing beyond the city walls, he achieved something even more subversive than freedom. He denied them the ending they craved. No triumphant recapture, no moralizing execution, just an empty arena and a question hanging in the dust. Who really lost that day, the gladiator who fled, or the empire that failed to break him? Centuries later, his legacy lingers in every story of the oppressed turning the tools of their bondage against their oppressors. Because sometimes the most powerful rebellion isn't just surviving the game, it's rewriting the rules mid-fight and walking away before they realize the match was never theirs to win. The throne room lay empty when she returned, not with an army at her back, but in the plain wool of a kitchen drudge, her face smudged with soot to hide the regal bearing no exile could erase. History remembers her as Queen Eurydis of Macedon, though the name she whispered to loyalists in those first dangerous days was simply Helena, a servant girl with unusually knowing eyes. Banished years earlier by scheming nobles who thought her too weak to fight back, she'd vanished into the mountains of Illyria. Yet all that time, she'd been gathering intelligence like a spider weaving unseen threads, which merchants could be bribed, which guards still muttered her name with reverence, which back corridors led to the royal chambers unnoticed. Her disguise was her brilliance. While her enemies scanned the horizon for invading forces, Eurydis slipped through their fingers like smoke. Ancient chronicles describe how she took work in the palace kitchens, mastering the rhythms of the household until she could predict every changing of the guard, every drunken revel that left corridors unguarded. By day, she scrubbed pots. By night, she met with allies in wine cellars and stable lofts, her whispered promises rebuilding the coalition that had once crowned her. The historian Theopompus records one astonishing detail. She even served wine to the very general who'd engineered her exile, close enough to hear him boast that the she-wolf of Macedon would never return. He never noticed the steady hands pouring his drink belonged to the woman plotting his downfall. What makes Eurydis's return extraordinary isn't just the daring, it's the patience. This wasn't a reckless charge at the gates, it was a years-long game of shadows. While other deposed rulers wasted their exile brooding or hiring mercenaries, she studied her opponent's weaknesses like a physician diagnosing disease. When the moment came, it wasn't swords that won her the throne back, it was timing. A well-placed rumor here, a redirected shipment of grain there, and suddenly the court was rippling with unrest. By the time she revealed herself, standing atop the palace steps in robes hastily stitched from smuggled silk, half the kingdom had already chosen her side without realizing it. Yet the real lesson of her story lies in the question it forces us to ask: how many other vanished rulers pulled off similar feats, leaving no chronicler to record their triumph? The Roman historian Tacitus hints at a Parthian princess who allegedly returned from exile as a dancing girl, her face veiled until the night she tore off her silks to reveal the royal tattoos beneath. Fragments of Egyptian papyri tell of a Nubian queen who supposedly escaped assassination by swapping places with her handmaid. then spent a decade building an underground network of priests and merchants before retaking her city in a bloodless coup. These stories blur the line between history and legend, but their persistence suggests a tantalizing truth. For every exile whose fate we know, there might be another who slipped back into power through the back door, their victories erased by those too embarrassed to admit they'd been outmaneuvered. Eurydis's legacy endures not because she was unique, but because she embodies the quiet power of the underestimated. While kings waged wars to prove their strength, she proved that sometimes the mightiest weapon is a disguise, the sharpest strategy is patience, and the most dangerous rebel is the one they've already forgotten. And in the flickering torchlight of that final night, when the usurpers awoke to find their own guards dragging them from bed, they learned too late the oldest rule of politics: never mistake a queen's retreat for surrender. Sometimes it's just the first move in a game they don't yet realize they're playing. The lanterns of Alexandria's great library still burned bright when the philosopher gathered his most dangerous scrolls, not the approved texts of rulers and priests, but the fragile papyri holding ideas too radical for their time. We don't know his name. History remembers him only as the scholar who fled the moonlit docks. But the fragments of his story reveal a midnight escape so precise, it feels like a parable. While city guards patrolled for smugglers and thieves, they overlooked the hunched figure rowing toward a waiting merchant ship. His cloak weighted with something far more perilous than contraband: knowledge. What made these scrolls worth risking death? Some say they contained treatises arguing the earth moved around the sun centuries before Copernicus. Others whisper of medical texts describing anatomy in ways that challenge divine creation. Whatever their contents, their survival hinged on the scholar's understanding of Alexandria's rhythms: the shift changes at the harbor, the bribable sailors, even the festival days when officials were too drunk to inspect cargo properly. According to a letter buried in the archives of Constantinople, he didn't just run, he orchestrated. A carefully planted rumor sent guards chasing shadows in the wrong district. A sympathetic librarian delayed inventorying the missing texts just long enough, and by dawn the scrolls were stowed between amphorae of olive oil, their ink safe from the damp. This wasn't just one man's flight, it was part of a hidden tradition. Across antiquity, thinkers became fugitives to protect ideas. The mathematician Hypatia's students allegedly smuggled her work out of Alexandria during her murder, hiding equations in laundry baskets. In China, banned Confucian texts survived because scholars memorized them word for word, disguising recitations as folk songs. Even Rome, for all its might, couldn't stop the spread of Lucretius's radical poem On the Nature of Things, copied in secret by enslaved scribes and tucked into grain shipments. Each act of defiance created an alternate library, one built not in marble halls but in the spaces between official histories. Yet the true impact of these escapes lies in their incompleteness. For every scroll saved, how many burned? For every scholar who vanished into the desert, how many were silenced? The irony is haunting. Civilizations that built monuments to knowledge also tried to control it, never realizing that ideas once set loose can't be chained. That unnamed philosopher's scrolls may have molded in some forgotten attic or been copied and recopied until his words became anonymous wisdom. But the act itself, the refusal to let truth drown, echoes wherever someone risks everything to whisper. This too is worth remembering. Perhaps that's why his story still resonates, because in every age there are those who understand that the most dangerous thing isn't a sword or a law. It's a thought someone tried and failed to erase. And sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person, one moonlit dock, and the courage to row toward the horizon before the guards wake up. The guards never saw it coming. There was the Roman centurion bleeding from a spear wound to the leg, his armor stripped away, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, sitting motionless in the corner of the enemy camp for days. To his Carthaginian captors, he was just another broken soldier, too injured to bother chaining, but pain, as any legionary knew, could be an excellent disguise. One moonless night, when the sentry's eyelids grew heavy and the campfires burned low, the centurion did something astonishingly simple. He stood up. No dramatic speeches, no tools hidden in his tunic, just a slow, deliberate movement, as if his body had finally remembered it was meant for freedom. Then, with the same measured pace he'd used to march into battle, he walked. Past the snoring guards, past the makeshift stockade, straight into the open darkness beyond. Ancient historians like Polybius record the aftermath with barely concealed admiration. By dawn, when his absence was discovered, the centurion was already miles away, his trail cold. The Carthaginians, furious, interrogated every prisoner. How had a wounded man slipped through their grasp? The answer was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. He hadn't acted like a prisoner. While others plotted elaborate tunnels or violent revolts, this soldier understood the power of perception. His captors expected desperation, not the quiet confidence of a man strolling through his own barracks. What makes this escape extraordinary isn't just its audacity, it's the psychology behind it. The centurion had spent years drilling Roman discipline into his men. Move with purpose, and others will assume you belong. In that enemy camp, he applied the same principle. Shoulders squared, gaze forward, steps unhurried, his body language screamed authority, not fear. It was a masterclass in blending in by standing out. Yet the real lesson lies in the reactions. When word reached Rome, the Senate didn't just celebrate his return, they studied his methods. Future manuals on military deception would cite this incident, noting that sometimes the best camouflage isn't invisibility, but the illusion of legitimacy. Even Hannibal's generals grudgingly admitted respect. After all, what stung more than losing a prisoner? Losing one who'd escaped without raising a sword or even his voice. Centuries later, his story still resonates because it strips escape down to its essence, a battle of nerves as much as strength. That centurion didn't need to break locks when he could bend expectations. And perhaps that's why his legend endured, because in the end, his greatest weapon wasn't stealth or speed. It was the unshakable calm of a man who knew the secret to freedom sometimes lies in walking away as if you'd never been caught at all. The night Carthage burned, the general was supposed to die. That's what history expected, a defiant last stand on the smoldering ruins, or a dignified surrender to Roman chains. Instead, as the fires lit the harbor like a funeral pyre, he simply wasn't there. No body in the ashes, no record of capture, just a whispered name on the lips of refugees fleeing by sea, Hasdrubal the Unbroken. To the Romans, his disappearance was an insult. They'd spent years chasing this man across mountains and deserts, only for him to vanish like smoke. Some legionaries claimed he'd drowned himself in shame rather than face Scipio. But the merchant ships docking in Alexandria told a different story of a figure in a plain cloak boarding a vessel bound for distant ports, his face hidden but his posture unmistakably military. Years later, rumors surfaced of Carthaginian loyalists gathering in the hills of Hispania, led by a strategist who knew Roman tactics a little too well. Coincidence, or the careful work of a man who understood that sometimes survival is the ultimate rebellion? What makes this vanishing so compelling isn't just the mystery, it's the duality of the man himself. Ancient accounts paint Hasdrubal as both brilliant and brutal, a commander who could outmaneuver entire legions yet reportedly sacrificed prisoners to Baal. To his enemies, fleeing confirmed his cowardice. To his people, it was strategy. After all, Hannibal himself had once slipped through Roman fingers for decades, a ghost haunting the empire's edges. Why wouldn't his protege do the same? The legend only grew with time. In North African folktales, he became the king across the water, forever just out of Rome's reach. Greek historians speculated he'd founded a hidden colony beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Even Roman senators, years later, would startle at reports of Carthaginian ships spotted with a familiar standard, a golden lion on crimson, the very banner Hasdrubal had carried at Zama. None were ever confirmed. Perhaps the truth lies in the fragments. A first-century trader's log mentioning a retired mercenary general tutoring Sicilian rebels in guerrilla tactics. A weathered graffito in a Cadiz tavern depicting a hooded man watching the sunset toward Carthage's ruins. These whispers suggest something more profound than escape, a life deliberately rewritten. Because in the end, Hasdrubal's greatest victory wasn't avoiding death, it was controlling the story. By disappearing, he denied Rome the satisfaction of his defeat and gave his people something more valuable than a martyr, hope that somewhere their lion still roared. And that's why his fate still captivates, not because we lack answers, but because the lack itself is the point. In a world where Rome meticulously recorded every conquered king paraded in chains, the absence of one name screams louder than any triumph. It whispers a tantalizing possibility that even against an empire that reshaped the map, some souls refused to be erased. Whether he died in obscurity or plotted revenge from some forgotten shore, Hasdrubal's legacy endures in the question mark he left behind. Because sometimes history's most powerful rebellions aren't fought with swords, but with silence. The torchlight flickered against the stone walls as the Vestal Virgin slipped through Rome's sacred halls, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. Condemned to be buried alive for breaking her vow of chastity, whether by choice or force, history doesn't say. She had hours before dawn would seal her fate. But the gods, it seemed, had other plans. A muffled scrape at the temple's side door, a hand extended from the shadows, and suddenly the most infamous woman in Rome was gone, vanished into the labyrinthine alleys of a city that both worshipped and feared her kind. What makes this escape so electrifying isn't just the daring rescue. It's what it exposed about the fragility of Rome's sacred order. Vestal virgins weren't just priestesses. They were living symbols of the empire's covenant with the gods. Their chastity was the mortar holding up the state's spiritual walls. So when this woman fled, she didn't just evade death, she cracked the illusion of divine infallibility. Ancient historians like Livy tiptoe around the incident, calling it an offense to tradition, but the subtext screams between the lines. If a Vestal could defy the system, what else might crumble? The logistics of her disappearance reveal a network of quiet rebels. Someone had to know the patrol routes of the temple guards. Someone arranged for a cart waiting near the Tiber. Its driver paid handsomely for silence. Perhaps most startling, someone inside the College of Vestals likely helped a sister priestess who knew the rituals well enough to fake the condemned woman's presence until the escape was complete. The details are lost, but the implication isn't. Even in the heart of Rome's most sacrosanct institution, dissent pulsed beneath the surface, yet the deeper rebellion lay in what came next. Unlike other fugitives who vanished into obscurity, this priestess allegedly resurfaced years later in a Greek trading port, living openly under a new name. According to fragmentary scrolls found in Pompeii, she'd married a merchant and borne children, a direct affront to the vows that would have killed her. The scandal reached Rome's ears, but by then the empire faced a dilemma. To drag her back would admit their failure, to ignore her would embolden others. Their solution, silence. The incident was scrubbed from official records, a tacit admission that some cracks once formed can't be repaired. This story forces us to ask how many others slipped through history's cracks. The poet Ovid hints at Vestals who walked unseen paths after accusations. Graffiti in Ostra's ruins jokes about a priestess who allegedly disguised herself as a plebeian and fled to Gaul. Even the rigid historian Tacitus concedes that at least 2 other Vestals disappeared under mysterious circumstances during Augustus's reign. Were these women victims or victors? The answer depends on who tells the tale. To Rome, they were stains on tradition. To us, they're reminders that even the heaviest chains, whether of bronze or belief, can sometimes be shrugged off by those willing to risk everything for a life unbound. Perhaps that's why this priestess lingers in the imagination, not because she was unique, but because she embodies the quiet defiance that simmers beneath every rigid system. In fleeing, she proved that the gods, like empires, could be questioned, and in surviving, she left behind not just a legend, but a challenge: who gets to decide what's sacred and who gets to walk away. The merchant's chains clinked against the ship's hull as he squinted at the night sky through a crack in the cargo hold. Imprisoned for debts he couldn't pay, his body might have been confined, but his mind was already charting a course. Years of navigating treacherous trade routes had taught him secrets the gods couldn't fathom: how to read the stars like a map, how to taste the wind for shifting currents, how to turn a scrap of cloth into a sail. When the moment came, his escape wasn't a frantic dash but a calculated voyage. A stolen knife became his tool to pick locks. Moonlight on the waves became his compass. And the very ship meant to carry him to servitude, it became his path to freedom. This wasn't just a jailbreak, it was a testament to how knowledge could dissolve walls. Ancient prisons were designed to break spirits, but they often overlooked the most dangerous weapon a captive could possess: expertise. Consider the Greek physician imprisoned during a siege, who mixed herbs from his meager rations to brew a potion inducing temporary paralysis. When guards collapsed, he walked out wearing one of their cloaks. Or the Persian architect who, condemned for angering a king, noticed a flaw in the dungeon's brickwork, a single loose stone that, over weeks of patient scraping, became a tunnel. Even the humblest skills could be repurposed. A baker memorized guard rotations by the rhythm of their footsteps. A potter molded clay into a convincing facsimile of his own face, leaving it propped on his cot as he slipped into the night. What unites these escapes is their defiance of a brutal truth. Captivity seeks to reduce people to their weakest selves, but history's greatest fugitives did the opposite. They weaponized their identities, transforming the very traits that made them valuable, their trades, their intellects, their intimate knowledge of the world, into keys. The merchant didn't just flee, he sailed home on the tides he'd spent a lifetime studying, proving that no cage can fully contain a mind trained to see beyond it. His story, like so many others, whispers a challenge across centuries. What do you know that they haven't thought to guard against? Because sometimes the difference between captivity and freedom isn't strength or luck. It's recognizing that the right skill at the right moment can become a lifeline. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson. These escapes weren't just acts of survival, they were reclamations of agency. When the merchant steered that stolen ship into open waters, he wasn't just escaping debt, he was declaring that no system could erase the worth of his hard-won wisdom. Every star he followed, every wave he rode, was a silent rebuttal to the idea that prisoners are powerless, because the cruelest prisons aren't always made of stone. Sometimes they're built on the assumption that those inside have nothing left to wield. But as long as one person remembers how to navigate by the heavens, or carve a key from bone, or brew freedom from bitter herbs, that assumption will always have a flaw, and flaws in the right hands become doorways. The stage had always been his refuge, a place where masks weren't just worn but became flesh. So when the actor stood trial for mocking the emperor in one too many satires, it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was the quiet thrill of a performer preparing for his most consequential role yet. The sentence was already passed, exiled to a barren island, a slow death by obscurity. But as the guards dragged him to the prison cell, his artist's eye was already studying their gait, their speech patterns, the way they jingled their keys with absent-minded arrogance. By dawn, he wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was the very man who'd bound him. Ancient playwrights loved this story, though they dared not name names. The details vary. Some claim he stole a guard's uniform during a staged riot. Others say he mimicked the jailer's voice so perfectly that his fellow prisoners handed him their own chain. But the core truth remains. This was an escape woven from observation and audacity. Imagine the scene: the actor, now clad in ill-fitting armor, barking orders with such conviction that real guards snapped to attention. The historian Diogenes hints at the aftermath, a citywide manhunt for a man who could be anyone because he'd spent a lifetime practicing how to disappear into a role. What makes this vanishing act extraordinary isn't just the theatrics, it's what it reveals about power and perception. In an empire where authority was performed as much as enforced, the actor exploited a flaw in the system. The guards weren't trained to see individuals, only uniforms. His performance held up a mirror to their blind spots. A later satire by Juvenal sneers at the incident, asking, "Who guards the guards?" But the deeper question lingers: how many other artists slipped through the cracks this way? Scroll fragments from Alexandria mention a mime who escaped slavery by impersonating his master's visiting cousin for an entire week. Pompey's graffiti jokes about a poet who avoided execution by reciting flattering verses in the voice of the magistrate's dead brother. Yet the real brilliance of the actor's disguise lies in its ambiguity. Did he truly escape, or was his recapture quietly swept under the rug to spare Rome's pride? Some accounts suggest he resurfaced years later in a traveling theater troupe in Gaul, still performing, this time as a former guard regaling crowds with tales of the prisoner who outwitted him. The irony would be delicious, the satirist once silenced now spinning his own legend. Perhaps that's why this story endures, because in the end, the actor didn't just cheat punishment, he exposed the performative heart of empire itself. Every toga-clad official, every sneering centurion was playing a part, and who better to exploit that than a man who knew all roles are temporary, all masks removable. His greatest satire wasn't what he'd written. It was the moment he proved that even Rome's mightiest could be fooled by a convincing enough costume. And in a world where identity was as fluid as the scripts he'd once performed, that lesson was more dangerous than any rebellion. After all, chains can't hold someone who refuses to be just one person. The stone walls of the palace still echoed with the footsteps of the usurpers when the deposed king slipped into the shadows. Years earlier, when his reign was secure, he'd commissioned a secret, an escape route disguised as a wine cellar, its floor hiding a narrow staircase that spiraled down into the bedrock. Few knew of its existence, not even his own queen. But that night, with enemy torches flickering through the halls above, that hidden passage became his lifeline. Ancient chronicles describe how he emerged miles away in a shepherd's hut, his royal robes traded for wool and dirt, his survival a testament to the oldest rule of power: always plan your exit before they plan your demise. What's astonishing isn't just the foresight, it's how common such tunnels were. The Hittite palace at Hattusa had a gate of the earth leading to underground waterways. The Assyrians engineered escape chutes behind throne rooms, some wide enough for a chariot. Even the Minoans of Crete built labyrinthine corridors beneath Knossos, though whether for ritual or retreat remains debated. These weren't mere architectural quirks, they were insurance policies carved in stone, because every ruler knew no matter how secure your reign seemed today, tomorrow might demand a vanish. The psychology behind these hidden routes reveals a darker truth about ancient power. Palaces were designed to intimidate, their towering walls proclaiming invincibility. But beneath that performative strength lay quiet vulnerability. A Babylonian tablet from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar Roman II details how builders were sworn to secrecy under penalty of death after constructing escape tunnels. The same kings who erected monuments to their own glory also dug backdoors into obscurity. It's a paradox that still resonates. The more unshakable a regime appears, the more it fears collapse. Yet some of these passages served grander purposes than escape. The Persepolis complex in Persia had subterranean roads used not just for flight, but for covert movement of troops and treasure. Chinese historians speak of Han Dynasty emperors using palace tunnels to slip into the city incognito, gathering unfiltered whispers from the streets. And in Byzantium, the Porphyra, a secret purple-dyed chamber where empresses gave birth connected to hidden docks, ensuring heirs could be spirited to safety if the city fell. These weren't just escape hatches, they were the veins of power pulsing beneath the visible world. The most fascinating examples blur the line between myth and engineering. Hebrew legends tell of King Solomon's flying carpet, not literal flight, but a network of underground tracks allowing his throne to magically appear in distant locations. The Maya at Tikal built causeways beneath their pyramids, possibly for both ceremonial processions and elite evacuation during revolts. Even Herodotus mentions Egyptian pharaohs who vanished during riots, only to reappear days later across the Nile, their method never explained. Were these feats of cunning or just stories embellished over time? The lack of evidence only deepens the allure. What unites all these hidden pathways is their testament to human ingenuity and anxiety. They remind us that even the mightiest rulers slept with one eye open, their dreams laced with contingency plans, and perhaps that's why their stories endure. Because in the end, every tunnel, every secret door whispers the same timeless lesson. No throne is permanent, but the will to survive, whether through stone, strategy, or sheer audacity, can outlast empires. The deposed king who crawled through darkness to emerge free didn't just save himself. He proved that sometimes the most powerful move isn't holding ground, but knowing when and how to disappear. The chains around his ankles should have been a death sentence, iron weights dragging him into the abyss the moment he hit the water. But as the prisoner plunged from the warship's deck into the moonlit Aegean, he did the one thing his captors never anticipated: he swam. Not in frantic, gasping strokes, but with the steady, measured rhythm of a man who'd spent his life reading currents. The sea, after all, had been his first home long before it became his prison. Ancient naval records from Rhodes tell fragments of the story: a prisoner of war, name lost to time, shackled aboard a Macedonian trireme as an oarsman. The crew assumed the weights would deter escape. Who could swim miles to shore with such burdens? But they'd underestimated the sheer, stubborn will of a man with nothing left to lose. Historian Polybius describes how the escapee used the chains themselves to his advantage, letting their momentum propel him downward during each stroke, turning oppression into propulsion. By dawn, when the ship's lookout finally noticed the empty bench, the prisoner was already crawling onto a rocky beach, his hands raw from dragging himself ashore. What makes this escape extraordinary isn't just the physical feat, it's the psychology of endurance. Modern marathon swimmers might train for years to cover such distances, but this man had no lifeguards, no energy gels, just the primal drive to survive. The waters he crossed weren't placid. The Aegean's nighttime currents are notoriously fickle, capable of sweeping even seasoned sailors off course. Yet he navigated them instinctively, likely using the stars or the faint glow of distant cooking fires as guides. His body, pushed beyond normal limits, became a testament to what adrenaline and desperation can achieve. The legend grew in the telling. Sailors swore they'd met a fisherman years later who bore scars from manacles, who laughed when asked how he'd outswim Macedonian warships. The sea doesn't take sides, he allegedly said. It only tests who wants freedom badly enough. Whether this was the same man or a folktale scarcely matters. The story crystallized a universal truth that the body's limits are often just suggestions, waiting to be shattered by someone refusing to accept them. Consider the parallels in other ancient escapes. The Spartan boy who ran barefoot through snow-covered mountains to deliver a message, his frostbitten feet a badge of honor. The Carthaginian messenger who allegedly crossed the Alps in 3 days without rest to warn of a Roman advance. These weren't superhuman feats, they were demonstrations of how ordinary people, when pushed, can tap into reserves they never knew they had. The swimmer's story endures not because he was unique, but because he embodies a question that still haunts us. What could we overcome if failure simply wasn't an option? Perhaps that's why his anonymous legacy resonates. In a world obsessed with names and titles, his refusal to be defined by his chains literally or metaphorically cuts deeper than any epic. He left no manifesto, no grand speech, just a set of wet footprints leading away from the shore and into the unknown. And sometimes that's the most powerful rebellion of all. Proof that even when the world weighs you down, you can still choose to keep swimming. History leaves us with gaps, silences where stories should be. Among the greatest of these mysteries are the ancient disappearances that defy all explanation, where prisoners, exiles, and fugitives slipped through time itself, leaving behind no trail, only whispers. These aren't just forgotten endings. They're deliberate vanishings crafted so perfectly that even now, centuries later, we're left staring at the empty space where a person should be. Take the case of the Persian nobleman who vanished from a locked tower. The records are sparse, but the details haunt. King Xerxes, furious over some long-lost insult, had him imprisoned in a stone cell with a single window high above the ground, barely wide enough to slip a hand through. Guards stood watch day and night, yet one morning the cell stood empty. No broken locks, no disturbed seals, just a single feather on the sill, glinting with morning dew. Some claimed divine intervention, the work of Ahura Mazda himself. Others whispered of bribed guards and a rope woven from torn bedding, but the most unsettling theory, that he was never there at all. That the whole imprisonment was theater, a way for Xerxes to save face while letting a rival quietly walk away. Then there's the Roman senator's daughter, exiled to a remote villa after a scandal that threatened to topple her family's reputation. The accounts describe her pacing the courtyard at dusk, watched by armed servants. By dawn, she was gone, not a footprint in the soft earth beyond the walls, not a single witness to her passing. Years later, a merchant swore he saw her in Alexandria, her hair cropped short like a scholar's, debating philosophy in the great library. But when officials investigated, no one matching her description could be found. Was it a case of mistaken identity, a staged death to escape disgrace, or something more unsettling? A woman who simply refused to play her assigned role, rewriting her story beyond Rome's reach. The mystery deepens with the Chinese alchemist who disappeared from an imperial prison, leaving behind only a pool of molten gold where his chains had been. The guards, terrified, spoke of a puff of smoke and a laugh echoing from the walls. Emperors later cited it as proof of immortality elixirs gone awry. Skeptics argued it was a clever ruse, distract the jailers with flash powder, swap places with a bribed servant, and slip into the night. But the alchemist's notes, recovered years later, contained a single line that chills even modern scholars: to vanish is not to flee. It is to become the question no one thinks to ask. What unites these stories isn't just the absence of answers, it's the way they expose the fragility of historical certainty. For every escape we can explain, there's one that mocks our need for closure. These gaps in the record aren't failures, they're invitations to wonder. To imagine, to consider that maybe, just maybe, some people were never meant to be caught, not by their enemies and not by history. And so we're left with the echoes. A name scratched into a prison wall and then hastily erased. A ship found adrift with no crew, yet provisions neatly stowed. A tomb open to reveal not bones, but a single unbroken seal and a pile of dust that might have been anything. These aren't endings, they're mirrors reflecting back our own obsession with resolution. Because the truth about the greatest escapes isn't that they defy logic, it's that they remind us how little we truly control and how vast the unknown remains. Perhaps that's why these unsolved vanishings linger in our collective memory, not because they taunt us with their secrecy, but because they offer something far more compelling: the possibility that even in a world of records and rules, some paths lead beyond the map. And for those who dared to take them, well, that's where history ends and legend begins. The stories of ancient escapes do more than just thrill us, they crack open a window into the human spirit at its most defiant. Think about it, across centuries and cultures, from the dankest dungeons to the most remote islands, people found ways to slip the bonds meant to hold them. But these aren't just tales of physical freedom. They're blueprints for resilience, coded in cleverness, patience, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. Take the Athenian prisoners who soared through bars under their jailers' noses, or the Vestal virgin who turned her own condemnation into a vanishing act. Their methods varied, but the core truth remains: when pushed to the edge, humans don't just endure, they adapt. What's striking is how these ancient strategies mirror modern survival psychology. The Spartan warrior who feigned weakness before overpowering his captors, that's the same principle behind today's hostage negotiation tactics, the art of controlling perception. The philosopher Anaxagoras, who escaped execution by disguising himself as a servant, demonstrated what cognitive scientists now call situational invisibility, leveraging others' assumptions to disappear in plain sight. Even the merchant who swam shackled through the Aegean embodies what extreme athletes call the second wind, the ability to push beyond perceived limits when survival is on the line. These stories aren't relics, they're case studies in resourcefulness that still resonate, but the deeper legacy lies in what these escapes reveal about systems of control and how to subvert them. Every prison, every exile was designed to break not just bodies but wills. Yet time and again, the imprisoned found cracks in the architecture, both physical and psychological. The actor who impersonated his jailer exposed how authority relies on costumes and scripts. The scholar who smuggled forbidden scrolls from Alexandria proved that ideas can't be contained by walls. Even failures like Jugurtha's recapture carried a warning to power. No cage is truly escape-proof if the person inside refuses to accept its logic. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is one of creativity under pressure. Consider the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal, whose disappearance became a legend. He didn't just flee, he left behind a mystery that destabilized Rome more than any battle could. Or the unnamed Persian noble who vanished from a tower, leaving only a feather behind. These weren't just acts of survival, they were performances turning defeat into enduring questions. In our era of constant surveillance and digital footprints, there's something almost magical about their ability to step off the stage of history on their own terms. Yet for all their brilliance, these stories also carry shadows. Not every escape ended in freedom. Many led to harder punishments or longer hunts. The enslaved rebel Salvius might have slipped through Rome's grasp, but thousands like him were never so lucky. That tension between hope and harsh reality is what makes these accounts so compelling. They don't offer tidy morals. Instead, they ask us, what would you risk for freedom? How far would you go? And in a world that still builds visible and invisible cages, from oppressive regimes to systemic inequalities, their echoes challenge us to look for the loose stones in the walls around us. The true power of these ancient escapes isn't that they teach us how to pick locks or forge documents. It's that they remind us resilience isn't a trait, it's a practice. Every time someone in chains studied their jailer's habits, or a condemned philosopher scribbled ideas in the dark, they were doing more than plotting survival. They were asserting a truth that terrifies tyrants and inspires the rest of us. No system gets the final word on a human being's worth, and that's why, millennia later, we still lean in when these stories are told. Not just for the thrill of the getaway, but for the whisper it leaves behind that even in the darkest night, there are always those who'll reach for the stars. From philosophers to pirates, Antiquity's great escapes reveal something fundamental about the human spirit, an unyielding refusal to accept the boundaries others impose. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were declarations of agency, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, creativity and courage could rewrite fate. Take the Spartan warrior who turned his chains into weapons, or the scholar who smuggled forbidden knowledge past sleeping guards. Each story, in its own way, exposes the same truth. Confinement is as much a mental construct as a physical one. What's striking is how these ancient escapes mirror modern struggles. The Vestal virgin who vanished into the night wasn't just fleeing death, she was rejecting the narrative that defined her worth solely by her chastity. The Carthaginian general Hasdrubal, whose disappearance became legend, demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful rebellion isn't victory, but denying your enemies the satisfaction of your defeat. These aren't relics of a distant past, they're blueprints for resilience. In an era where freedom can feel increasingly fragile, their stories remind us that oppression relies on our belief in its inevitability. Yet these escapes also carry shadows. For every successful flight, countless others ended in brutal reprisals. The enslaved rebel Salvius might have slipped through Rome's grasp, but his story forces us to confront the thousands who didn't. That tension between hope and harsh reality is what makes these accounts so compelling. They don't offer tidy morals. Instead, they ask uncomfortable questions. How much would you sacrifice for liberty? What lines would you cross? And in a world that still builds cages, both visible and invisible, their echoes challenge us to look for the loose stones in our own walls. The legacy of these escapes isn't just in the daring feats themselves, but in the way they unsettled power. Every tunnel dug, every disguise worn, every prophecy manipulated was a crack in the illusion of control. The actor who impersonated his jailer didn't just escape, he exposed how authority depends on performance. The philosopher Anaxagoras, who vanished before his execution, proved that ideas can't be silenced with a sword. Even failures like Jugurtha's recapture carried a warning. No system is foolproof when the human spirit refuses to be measured. So what do these stories leave us with? Not just admiration for the past, but a lens for the present. They remind us that freedom isn't given, it's taken, often in ways that defy expectation. Whether through brute strength, cunning, or sheer stubbornness, These individuals refused to let their circumstances have the final word, and perhaps that's why we're still drawn to their tales centuries later. Because in the end, the greatest escape isn't the one from chains or cells, it's the one from the stories others try to write for us. Now it's your turn. Which of these escapes left you breathless? Was it the merchant who swam shackled through the Aegean, or the queen who reclaimed her throne disguised as a servant? Drop your favorites in the comments. We'd love to hear what resonates with you. And if you're hungry for more tales of defiance and ingenuity, don't forget to subscribe. History's mysteries are far from over, and the next great escape might just be waiting for us to uncover.